behavior, construction of social percepts, evaluation of attitude objects, the translation of thought into behavior, all of which happens automatically. So much so, in Barge's view, that he suggested that we substitute social cognition for what he called social ignition as the dominant metaphor for social psychology. Again, the idea that these things just happen automatically without any conscious intent. A little bit later on, Barge proposed what he called an automotive model for behavior, which even further downplays the role of consciousness in social interaction. He says, in this particular paper, he says, look, the traditional model for social psychology is however you get your impression of the situation, whether through automatic or controlled processes, still whatever you do in that situation is the product of conscious thought. That is, you deliberately choose to engage in one kind of behavior as opposed to another. And once you've deliberately chosen that response, yeah, it engages automatically. When I say, I would like to lift my right arm, I don't say, oh, I'd like to engage my trapezius muscles and I would like to loosen my dendrite tendon or whatever the hell it is that I've got in my arm. We don't do anything like that. We just lift our arm, right? So, yes, there's a role for automaticity, but between these automatic processes, there is conscious thought. Barge argued no, that goals and motives in social interaction are themselves automatically evoked by various features of the situation, and even that aspect of social interaction operates automatically and outside of consciousness. This position has become very popular in social psychology, so much so that I've come to call it the automaticity juggernaut. This kind of wild ride that some social psychologists have been on, which contains a number of different propositions to it. The first is that social behavior is largely the product of automatic processes. That in a social situation, you may have conscious percepts of the situation, you may have conscious goals, you may have conscious automations. That's fine. None of that makes any difference to what you actually do. That, in fact, what happens in social situations is automatically triggered by a preconscious analysis of the situation and by the preconscious evocation of various kinds of goals. Consciousness plays a role in these situations, but consciousness is, in fact, an afterthought. It's something that you rely on to give plausible or acceptable reasons for your behavior. When I go home tonight and I do something dumb or whatever, as I'm sometimes wont to do, my wife will turn to me and say, "Why did you do that?" At which point, I will make up some reason. Okay, well, I read about this thing, and I thought it would be an interesting thing to try it out, or whatever it is. None of that actually makes any difference to why I did what I did, okay? Why I did what I did has its roots in various kinds of preconscious and pre-attentive processes. The implication of this, if you take it to the extreme, as some of these individuals do, is that we are, in fact, zombies after all, okay? Not because zombies are conscious too, which is the position that the philosopher Dan Dennett takes. Any organism that can perform the same functions as a conscious being has to be thought of as conscious itself. That's his essential position. But we're all zombies in this view because consciousness is itself epiphenomenal. Okay? We have consciousness, but consciousness plays no causal role in what goes on in social interaction. What plays a causal role in what goes on in social interaction is a product of automatic processes operating outside conscious awareness and outside of conscious control. Okay, now here, just so you know that I'm not picking nits here, It is 13 years after that first statement in a paper entitled The Automaticity of Everyday Life. The more we know about the situational causes of psychological phenomena, the less need we have for postulating internal, conscious, mediating processes to explain these phenomena. And then later, the trend has already begun. It can do nothing but continue. It's like even that's an automatic process, right? There's nothing you can do about it. Later in that paper, there's a section called "Is Consciousness Riding into the Sunset?" in which Barge asserts that automaticity pervades everyday life. Automatic, non-conscious processes pervade all aspects of mental and social life, okay, despite what we may assume to the contrary, okay? And then finally, 2 years later, Barge and Tanya Chartrand in another paper entitled The Unbearable Automaticity of Being. Again, most of a person's everyday life is determined not by their conscious intentions and deliberate choices, but by mental processes that are put into motion by features of the environment that operate outside of conscious awareness and guidance. Okay? Now, Barge is not the only person to take this position. It's a very popular position in social psychology. But both he and others have invoked what's known as the naturalization process to explain kind of what they're doing. You've all heard versions of this in one science course or another. There was a time when human beings thought that they were supremely rational at the center of the universe, and science has gradually whittled away at this view. Copernicus taught us that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and Darwin taught us that men and women were just animals, no different from any other animal. Freud, at the turn of the 20th century, argued that man was actually fundamentally irrational, driven by these unconscious, seething, aggressive, and sexual drives that dominated what we do. Barge and other people like Wagner have suggested that Freud, in fact, got it wrong. Okay, it's not just that we're fundamentally irrational, but that we are, in fact, automatons. Okay, that consciousness plays so little role in our everyday life that we can pretty much ignore it. Okay, here's another example of this from Op Dijksterhuis in the Netherlands, very prominent European proponent of this view, who's proposed recently what he calls an unconscious thought, the unconscious thought alternate theory, which argues that our choices, when we make choices, are determined by unconscious processes, not by rational deliberation. And Dijksterhuis has gone so far as to say that, in fact, unconscious thought is superior to conscious thought. Not just a competitor with conscious thought, but it's better not to engage in conscious thinking about various kinds of things, because on a variety of dimensions, unconscious thought turns out to be better. Okay? So the general idea here is that automaticity pervades cognition. From 1984 to 2012, okay, you can see basically the same line going through. That automaticity starts out at the beginning of social interaction and operates all the way through to the end of the social interaction. Wherever you see an input or a transformation or an output or the invocation of a motive or the making of a choice or anything else that goes on, all of that is governed by automatic processes. Which leads us to, again, the most recent paper in which Barge and his colleague offer what they call the automaticity principle, in which they express strong doubts about the role of conscious control, that situational influences are overwhelmingly powerful in their effect on social behavior, and that those situational influences are themselves mediated by automatic processes, that introspective awareness has its limitations. We really don't know, just by thinking about it, by looking into our own minds, why we do what we do, And they also point to the rise of dual process models in social psychology, which accept that there is some distinction between automatic and controlled processes, but basically argue that the very features of automatic processing, like that they're very fast and don't consume any kind of cognitive capacity, mean that they're going to dominate the behavior at the expense of conscious processes. So that these unconscious processes are operating automatically affect both how a person perceives the world, the mental representation of the situation, and how the person behaves in response to the world, how he or she acts on this mental representation. Sometimes you can see what might be thought of as a kind of softening of the views on the part of these individuals, okay? Here's a nice quote from just a couple years ago from Barge. Any process of sufficient complexity to be of interest to social psychologists involves a complex interplay between conscious and automatic processes. But you wouldn't get that impression from reading the other quotes that I gave you, okay? Well, there's no complex interplay involved when somebody says in print that behavior is 99 and 44/100% automatic, okay? It's just, there's no complexity there at all. But a quote like this, which seems to agree that there is a complex interplay of automatic and controlled processes, raises the question of just what that interplay looks like. When we look at some when we look at some aspect of social behavior, what proportion of that behavior is a product of automatic processing, and what proportion of that behavior is a product of conscious processing. In fact, the claims about the automaticity of social behavior are very, very, very weak in terms of their evidentiary base. If you think about the experiment that I just described to you, the interruptions of the experimenter study, the argument there is that reading words about rudeness automatically primes the person to perceive somebody as rude and to behave rudely in turn, or something like that. But in fact, in that experiment, Barge and his colleagues don't actually show that the priming that took place was in fact automatic in nature. Okay, remember we have 4 canonical features of an automatic process: inevitable evocation, incorrigible completion, efficient execution, and parallel processing. These are all things that can be measured experimentally, but in that experiment, none of them were. Okay? So we actually don't know for sure that the priming took place automatically. It's entirely possible that subjects, when they're out there, said to themselves, this is weird that this experimenter is doing this. And then they think back and they said, oh, you know, there are an awful lot of words related to rudeness in those sentences. That's kind of weird too, you know? Maybe the one thing has to do with the other, and once the subjects kind of get the idea that the experiment isn't quite over, then all bets are off. Moreover, in this literature, there is a tendency to equate the automatic with the incidental. Barge assumes that the priming effect in his experiment took place automatically because subjects were not deliberately instructed to read the words and use them as a guide for their behavior, right? But it's not that hard an experiment. These were NYU students. They're pretty bright students. They can form sentences out of words. There's lots of cognitive capacity left